A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
So an opportunity today to update the latest developments on religious freedom in Australia. Of course, if passed, a religious discrimination bill proposed by our federal government or the similar legislation being discussed by the states will have huge implications for schools and religious institutions like churches. Well, we're also going to check into how you can go a little deeper in these issues and plan some action in your own local community. Freedom for Faith is planning a major conference that's coming up. It's called Freedom 24. It'll be held in August. It'll take stock of where we are at right now and where we are going with expert analysis. Mike Southon is Executive Director of Freedom for Faith, activating the church to defend religious freedom. Mike, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back.
Mike, let's start with what is the most significant and most current issue that's going on right now. And today, in the state of Queensland, a letter being sent to the Premier about the new Respect at Work legislation. Give us your insights into how significant this is.
Yeah, so this is a follow-on from, you may recall, the anti-discrimination bill that the Queensland government proposed a couple of months ago that we were talking about. Now, they've pulled that bill, but they replaced it with a very cut-down version, which is trying to do a few of the things they were trying to do without, in theory, causing the problems that the old bill caused. This is a bill that's supposed to implement the government's Respect at Work report, which is just supposed to stop harassment and vilification and things like that in the workplace. It's a bill that's supposed to make the workplace a safer place. That's great. It's all in favour with that. It's just, however, had some unintended consequences in the way that they've written it, because they wrote it quite quickly by pulling the anti-discrimination bill, and some of those things are going to have some significant problems for faith communities.
Okay, so while you've got anti-discrimination bills being discussed at a federal level, they're also being discussed at a state level. The one we're talking about today is in the state of Queensland, and they pulled their version of their anti-discrimination bill, and they've brought it to a very cut-down version called Respect at Work legislation. So the sorts of things that they, and I remember there was a bit of celebration about that when they'd pulled that bill, but then coming back with a cut-down legislation, there's also problems here. Give us an outline of what those problems look like to you.
Yeah, and I think the first thing to say is that these problems look like they're unintended consequences. What they're trying to do is stop harassment in the workplace, but the language is sloppy and it's starting to capture religious organisations. The really worst bit is that there's, in vilification, which is saying you can't say terrible things about another person, you can't inspire hate about another person, they've used the word hateful. So you can't do something which would be hateful towards another person. Now, the word hateful actually means a whole lot of different things. And so instead of just making it illegal to incite hatred, they've made it illegal to say something which is hateful. Now, if you say something bad about me, I consider that hateful. So, it's very vague. The real problem on top of that is, who is the one who gets to define what something is hateful? Well, the answer in the legislation is the person to whom it was said. That a reasonable person who has the same characteristics of whoever heard what was being said to them, if they consider it hateful, then this is something which is illegal. That's really problematic because different people find different things hateful, don't they? I mean, what I find hateful, what you find hateful, completely different things. So how do I know what I can say?
Interesting, isn't it? And just to pause here and reflect this for a few moments, because when the government is using the word hateful in proposed legislation, that's got problems because, as you know, and as listeners will know, oftentimes as Christians we get accused of being hateful. Well, we aren't going to be hateful because if we're taking the words of Jesus, going back to the New Testament, a biblical foundation for what Christians are. Well, we don't hate because hate is akin to murder. So certainly we're not going to be looking to be hateful. What you're suggesting that the Queensland government is thinking of here is that it's just so airy-fairy to be reflecting on feelings as the things that make you feel as though something said is actually hateful. That's the problem, isn't it, around just an emotional response to something someone says, even if it's misconstrued?
Yeah, it's just such a vague word. It could easily be solved by changing the word hateful to something much clearer. Inciting hatred, for instance, which is a nice, clear thing that none of us want to do. But, most faiths teach that other faiths are wrong and are likely to go to hell. Christians, in one way or another, most of us teach that, but so do most Muslims. They teach that about us. So if a Muslim's out there teaching that Jesus was not God, and anyone who believes that that Jesus is God is going to hell, is that hateful? Should that be illegal? So it's just such a vague concept. But as I said, it's pretty easy if the government wants to fix this bit of the legislation to make it work.
So in some sense, any robust debate that would be comparison of faith or comparison of, what's the best way to raise your family, what's the best way to live your life, as a married individual, any discussion about that, any sort of robust discussion would be in some sense outlawed. Is that one way of thinking of it?
It could be considered hateful, absolutely. Or outside of religion, one group of people say that a man could not become a woman. Another group of people say men can become women. Both sides consider what the other person says to be hateful. And so it shuts down, this unfortunate choice of word, just shuts down all sorts of debate, because someone can just turn around and go, oh no, that's hateful. You can't say that to me.
As you say, this may not be something intentional. It could be about unintentional consequences that come from the proposed legislation. I imagine that, if there is a letter that's coming from church leaders here, we might hope that it doesn't fall on deaf ears, as some of those earlier letters that have been written at federal level and at state levels appear to have fallen on deaf ears. What are the concerns around the possibilities that it might be something that these church leaders writing this letter, whether it'll be listened to or not?
Well, the fate of the previous anti-discrimination legislation is quite encouraging. It was terrible legislation that was going to cause significant damage to faith communities. We wrote a letter. Your listeners wrote letters to their local MP. The government listened, and they pulled the legislation. I'm quite hopeful that if once again the faith leaders speak out, but also all your listeners speak out to their local MPs and say, come on, we can fix this. I'm quite hopeful that the government would want to listen. It seems like they've been listening over the past couple of months.
Okay, let's talk about the faith leaders that have written this latest letter. Whose names are signed on the bottom of it? Give us perhaps some names and some denominations, because, listeners coming from different denominations might be wondering whether their leader is actually writing and signing this letter.
We've got Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, Seventh-day Adventist, ACC. We've got both Shia and Sunni Muslim leaders. It's an extraordinary broad range of faith leaders who have signed up onto this letter. Once the letter is made public in the next day or so, it'll be up on our website, and you can have a look at the list of almost 20 faith leaders who have signed. We've got archbishops, we've got moderators, we've got everybody.
I'm just looking at those names and those denominations now. You've got the Lutherans, you've got Seventh-day Adventists are included in there. You've got the Fellowship of Evangelical Churches and the Wesleyan Methodist Church of Southern Queensland, the Wesleyan Methodist Church of Northern Queensland. You've got a really, as you say, a big cross section. And so for those church leaders to be able to unite together around the common wording of a letter that's going to be sent to the Queensland Premier, that in itself is significant, because must be a bit of a pat on the back time for you guys too, to have been able to unite these church leaders around some common wording to be able to present to the government.
It is a very exciting time for the churches in Queensland that we can all work together and agree on a strategy, agree on our concerns, and come with a united voice. It's far more powerful when we do it this way, and it's a very exciting time.
Now, some other things that are in the letter, and when you talk about things to do with the word hatred, and we might even be just a little bit dismayed that legislation is going to point that word hatred at Christians. But other things that are in there, what else stands out among the dot points or the main issues that the church leaders are addressing?
Well, the other big problem is a collection of laws based around the idea of harassment on the basis of sex. Now, in principle, the idea, harassment on the basis of sex, means you can't harass a woman because she's a woman. That's a great thing to ban. And it's great to have laws that workplaces cannot create hostile environments for a woman to be a woman. The problem is that they went and drew a very broad definition of the basis of sex. And so you can see where we're going, where transgender questions and all these sorts of questions start getting wrapped into the idea of the basis of sex. So what does it mean to harass on the basis of sex? So I'm not just saying, being mean to a woman because she's a woman, that definitely should be banned. But what about disagreeing with somebody that a man could become a woman? Is that now harassment on the basis of sex? And again, I think this is just because they've not used clear language in the legislation. But what we end up with is workplaces end up with a positive duty to eliminate harassment. And now if disagreeing that a man could become a woman is harassment, all of a sudden workplaces have a responsibility to stop these beliefs, to stop these conversations from happening. And faith-based workplaces are not exempt from this. So literally a church would be included.
Well, it sounds to me like the way you're describing it, every workplace is included in that. So this is not something that when you talk about religious freedom, you think about what's going on behind the walls of that church, or even what sort of public announcements a church might make, but it's every single person who is a part or a member of a church and what they are now likely to be open to in their own workplace. There are significant things here, and I want to invite listeners to join into the conversation today. Is this something that is experienced in your own working environment, or what do you think might happen in your own working environment if these sorts of laws are passed in Queensland? And undoubtedly these sorts of laws are being discussed in many other states and territories as well. We might even touch on some of those things. But let me open our talkback line on 1800 316 316. What are your feelings about the sorts of proposed laws that are there in the state of Queensland, or that may be a part of legislation that could come to the fore federally? 1800 316 316 to join in the conversation. And I mentioned a little earlier, there is a Freedom for Faith special conference that's coming up, and it's called the Freedom for Faith National Conference. It'll be held on Monday, the 5th of August. It'll be in Sydney, but it'll be live streamed free, and you'll be able to participate in it to be able to get a little deeper insight into that and how you might even be able to do things locally in your own local town or community. That might be really important. It's going on around the country. There are some big things that are brewing in New South Wales. Mike, the New South Wales government is considering its response to Alex Greenwich's equality bill. What are your perceptions of what's going on here?
Yeah, well, the Equality Bill is scheduled to be voted on in about a month's time. And to remind your listeners, while talking about Queensland unintentional consequences of rushed legislation, the Equality Bill in New South Wales has been brought by the independent Alex Greenwich, and it is just a terrible bill from beginning to end. It will cause huge damage to women, to children, to faith communities. It is a very, very, very dangerous bill. As a summary, it introduces sex self-ID. That is, someone could just put in a piece of paper to the government and instantly change their birth certificate to another gender, not just male or female, any descriptor they choose. And that changes your birth certificate permanently. and you never find out what actual sex that person was at birth anymore. It changed children being able to consent to medication, including puberty blockers, and override their parents and ignore their parents, even under the age of 16. It removed restrictions around sex work. It removed legislation which banned coercing a woman to become a prostitute. It stripped religious institutions of protections and anti-discrimination. It allowed for people to effectively buy babies from overseas, from incredibly poor countries. It's just a terrible bill. So, where are we up to? The government is considering its response right now, and we're expecting in the next couple of weeks for the government to say this is what we're going to do with the bill. We know they're talking at the moment inside caucus, inside the party, and now is the time that we need to convince them there is nothing good about this bill. This bill needs to die.
Okay, now is the time for action. I'll just sow that seed for listeners, because you might be thinking, is it time to be in touch with my MP? Now is the time for action. We'll tell you how to do that shortly. Hey, we're taking calls on 1800 316 316. We've been talking about a letter that is being delivered to the Queensland Premier today from church leaders. We're also on to talking about things that are developing in New South Wales and the New South Wales government response to Alex Greenwich's equality bill. You might have a thought or two in either, but we're taking calls on 1800 316 316. Let's hear from David in Redcliffe in Queensland. Hey, David, welcome.
Hello.
Hey, David.
Yes, it's not Redcliffe's in Queensland, it's Redcliffe's in Victoria.
Well, thank you for correcting me there. Redcliffe's in Victoria. What is Redcliffe's near?
Mildura.
Near Mildura. Fabulous.
Yes.
Well, great to hear from you, David.
Fundraiser.
Very good. Hey, what are your thoughts for our conversation?
Very upsetting and disappointing that whether it be Christians or the Australian Church, for some reason they are saying that the Muslims are a religion and part of the Abrahamic religion, which is a total falsehood. And the sooner a lot of countries see the truth of the Muslim religion, they won't want anything to do with it.
Well, they're interesting dimensions to raise, and dimensions that actually need a lot of time in explanation. But I wonder if our special guest has got a thought or two. Mike, do you have a thought for David?
I think in a pluralistic society, we actually have to be very careful to allow faiths to debate and to argue with each other. And so we don't want to create an environment where we shut down one faith and what they say, because that's just going to be a weapon that gets used against us. The reality is the truth of the gospel will win. If we allow religious freedom for everyone to put out their point of view, I just believe that under God and under the Holy Spirit, as we proclaim the gospel freely, then people will hear the truth and will come to Christ. I think that's the best response that we have at the moment, is to just keep preaching Jesus.
And on the issue around Abrahamic faiths, for David here, Islam really came along in the 6th century, and of course we're talking 600 years after Christ. So Islam itself is not what you'd call an Abrahamic faith. Of course, you can trace Arabs back to Abraham, Isaac, and of course
Arabs are different people.
So Arabs would descend from Abraham, but yes, it's not an Islamic faith that's descended from Abraham. And often I like to have an expert on me when we're discussing these things, and you might find some great podcast conversations around issues like this. If you're searching the
crazy book, and you'll see how much of corruption's in it.
Sorry, say that again.
Read their silly Quran and see how much corruption's in it. A 50-year-old man marrying a 9-year-old girl, what do you think of that?
Yes, well, there are all sorts of things, values that we ascribe for our present time that sometimes are difficult when you start to look at what happened maybe 1,500 years ago. This does illustrate something, doesn't it? Let's come back to Mike Southon. on religiousness and on being able to have robust debate and the thought that hatred might arise. Mike, what are your thoughts here around any sort of consequences that might be from these sorts of bills that are either federal or state around religious freedoms?
Well, this is the problem with vilification legislation, is that this very conversation could well have been considered to be hateful by a Muslim who was listening in. And this is why we just have to be very careful with the language that we use, and why the Queensland government needs to fix the legislation they've got in their proposed bill. Because we have to disagree. We have to disagree strongly. We have to call each other wrong. We have to be able to say that the other person's going to hell even, because that's when we have true freedom to debate these fundamental and important truths. And so I would encourage, this is the right debate to have. If you want to know about the truth of Islam, go read the Quran, go debate with people, go learn, go challenge. And it's that freedom to argue, to freedom that say other people are wrong, which we need to be protecting.
Okay. David, anything further to add? Because you did raise an important point, the ability to be able to say you're wrong and we're right, and even to have a robust debate around that. But that might be considered hateful. Are you concerned that what you would say could be considered hateful?
I'm not concerned, because a neighbouring place next to my country on October the 7th jumped the fence and killed innocent people. And their whole charter is to get rid of Jews wherever they find them. So as far as I'm concerned, no.
Okay.
It's not insulting to them. They need to read their book and see how disgusting Muhammad was.
All right. Well, it is a interesting perspective to be able to have an open conversation about the issues around historic Islam, around Muhammad, the Prophet, and the way that our values today are different from the values of that day, and the way that those values are impacting our current climate today. And that's where I guess Christians need to be able to point out those things that are not coming from our Christian foundation for faith, and that those things are in contrast to that, and those things are then wrong. Any further, just a concluding thought from you at all around this sort of issue here, Mike?
The only thing I'd like to say is that this need to be able to argue with each other and say that each other are wrong is actually also agreed to by the very Muslims we're talking about. There's both Shia and Sunni leaders are signing that letter to the Premier saying we need the freedom to have these arguments. So I say, bring on the arguments.
Okay, and David from Red Cliffs near Mildura in Victoria. David, thank you so much for your contribution. And that's an interesting one to raise, because when you've got issues around religious freedom, it's not just Christians here, and we might point out that the majority of those who have signed that letter are Christians, but there are, in fact, some Muslim leaders who are on that signing there as well, because religious freedom affects all sorts of different religions. Thoughts from you here, Mike?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the very idea of religious freedom in the modern world came out of the Reformation, came out of the arguments between Protestants and Catholics. And we sat down and we realized we need the ability to both live in the same country and disagree with each other. In fact, Australia was founded, I think half the number of people who landed in the First Fleet were Catholic and the other half were Protestant. And modern Australia has, from the very beginning, had to figure out, how do we have people who disagree so fundamentally living together? And that's what we need to be able to keep figuring out, is what does pluralism look like? You don't silence people. You let them argue.
Mike Southon is our guest. We're going to break for news, and we'll take some more calls after Vision National News. 1800 316 316. Our talkback line is open. Mike Southon is Executive Director of Freedom for Faith. Now, Freedom for Faith has a national conference coming up, and they'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of these sorts of topics we're talking about today, whether it's across the changes in legislation in Queensland or what's coming for New South Wales, Monday the 5th of August at Village Church in Annandale in Sydney. But for those listening all around Australia, there's a free live stream and tickets are going to be available. In fact, Mike, it might be good for us to take some calls. Let's hear from Lawrence, who is in Perth in Western Australia. Hello, Lawrence. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. My cynical streak coming out. The members of government go to lawyers to create legislation. If legislation becomes law and a complaint is made against a person of faith, they in turn need to go to lawyers to sort things out.
Okay, so there's like a circle here. The lawyers get to make the laws, and the lawyers get to reap the benefits of all of the litigation that goes on beyond. Let's get a thought actually on that from Mike Southon. Mike, what are your thoughts here for Lawrence?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point that Lawrence raises, because a lot of the times when we point out to governments, this legislation is vague. These are the sorts of unintended consequences you can have. Sometimes their response is, the courts will sort that out. The courts will be able to figure that out. That will be sorted out in the courts. They just don't realise how expensive it is to sort one of these things out in the courts. If you're going to take an issue, say a school gets sued, it goes up through the state and it has to go up to the federal and goes up to the Supreme Court, we could be talking $500,000 worth of legal fees and effort put into that. So we need to fix this legislation before it hits the table, before it gets passed by government. Waiting for some court cases 3 years down the track to sort out the ambiguity, it's not only expensive, it also means that for all this time, nobody knows what actually is legal and what's not legal. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We got Shakespeare was right about the lawyers. Let's get them out of the picture and just focus straight on getting our politicians to do the right thing the first time.
Lawrence, did you have something further to add there? That was a really interesting and deeper dimension around who benefits the most from all of this very confusing legislation. Did you have something more to add?
Yes, I've heard it said too that the process is the punishment.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is what I've had so many guests on the radio saying, you know, eventually we go through all of these processes and we appear before tribunals and such things, and eventually we get exonerated, but the punishment is the process. Thoughts from you here, Mike?
Oh, time and time again, this is exactly the problem with bad legislation. The famous example, of course, was Archbishop Porteous, who wrote a pamphlet that went to Catholic schools talking about the Catholic belief in what marriage is and what marriage isn't. Gets dragged before the tribunal, goes through a huge, expensive process for the claim to be dropped eventually. So no ruling gets brought in, but still, all the expense, all the time, all the effort. This legislation, which is vague, we talked about the word hateful before, it just means that the process can be used over and over again to silence people, to punish people. It's extremely dangerous, but I'll keep going back to this is why we need to tell our politicians now to fix our legislation, which is why you, dear listeners, need to be telling your politicians, I'm worried about this. I don't want to be punished by the process. I want you to fix the law now.
Thank you so much to Lawrence from Perth for your call, 1-800-316-316, to join in our conversation. Before we take another call, just come back to this Action Is Now. I mentioned this as we restarted this hour. And we came around the sorts of things we're talking about. We were talking just before the news about the Equality Bill in New South Wales. You're saying right now is the time for New South Wales people to take some action and to contact their MP. How significant is it to take action right now? Oh,
it's critical. As much law as gets written by lawyers and everything that happens, in the end, laws get passed by politicians. And there are 100 or something politicians in any one state who are going to come together in Parliament and decide whether this law passes or not. And it's going to be the government who decide. And they're going to get together and think about, do we pass this law? Do we not? What are we going to do next week? How are we going to vote next week? And so when your local MP understands what your concerns are and understands how dangerous this bill is, that MP can go into their party room and say, I don't like this bill. I want to fix it. I want to change it. it's not about changing what the bureaucracy does. It's not changing about what the lawyers do. If we can change the minds of our politicians, then we can fix our laws.
Ordinary people don't speak in legal jargon. When you're contacting your MP, Mike, how straight up front are you going to be with the way that you express yourself? I mean, you might go leading a delegation of your own church leaders in your own church community, but you might be writing a letter or sending an email. How much of the legal jargon do you have to have in your own presentation to your local MP, or do you just say it like it is? This is wrong.
Oh, no. The best letter to an MP is short, polite and clear. You just say, I'm really worried about this bill. I want you to fix it. The end. Now, when we've got something really helpful like the Faith Leaders letter that's just been put in Queensland or the equivalent that exists in New South Wales, you can attach that to your letter and say, here is what the Faith Leaders said. Would you please read this and let me know, are you going to support what they're asking for? So you just need to say, I'm really worried about this. I'm just a local person. This is my address. Can you please do something about this?
Okay, so please fix this. That's not difficult. And as you say, if you want to attach a letter that's been written by faith leaders, that actually just supports what you're saying. Please fix this. These things are wrong. And you might trust that those church leaders who will have their own legal support base will have actually helped to craft those things so that they are courteously but clearly written. Hey, we're taking calls on 1800 316 316. Let's take another call. Vince is in Brisbane in Queensland. Hey, Vince, welcome.
Hi. G'day, Neil. Look, Neil, I just want to quickly make the point. I know Mr. Southon, he was earlier making the point at some in the international the federal legislation, that some of the wording, like using hateful rather than inciting hatred, he thinks that might have been just an unfortunate choice of words, but my gut instinct says that was deliberate. Just when I think about over the last few decades, the woke subversion and indoctrination of our Western civilization institutions too, including Christianity, I'm going to lean that's deliberate. By making it kind of vague, they can make the whole interpretation of it very broad. Oh, and the very recent too, the way the Albanese government rammed through that terrible the digital ID bill. That whole process to me sounded very sneaky and nefarious. So, yeah.
All right. Deliberately deceitful. This is a good one here. And Vince, thank you so much for this insight. Maybe these things are not oversights or just loose language in, a reformulated cut-down bill. Maybe these things are actually quite intentional, and they're very clever lawyers who've written it, and they would probably be anticipating what people like Mike Southon might say here. But what are your thoughts here? Mike, intentional or accidental?
Both. So remember that the way that laws get written is complicated, and lots of people are involved in it. Could it be that there are that there are clever people in the right steps in the drafting who knew what the word hateful, let's take that as the example, knew how vague hateful would be, knew what the implications would be, and advocated for that word to be in there? Absolutely. We know that going to New South Wales, the legislation that was drafted for Alex Greenwich was drafted by advocacy organisations who knew exactly what the implications of that legislation was going to be. But then, is there a conspiracy? There is definitely a group of people, a category of people who would love to silence religious speech, but they're not the majority. So when we say, okay, there is a push, and there are advocates saying you've got to ban this, you've got to stop this, but then the average politician on both sides of the aisle just wants to help society. Most Labor politicians got into it because they care about schools and hospitals. Most Liberal politicians got into it because they care about small business and individual freedoms. And they just want to help the society. And they have these advocates in their ears telling them, you've got to do this, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. And so what the average politician is going to let through, they probably don't understand the implications of what they're going to let through. So I always do talk about these things as unintended, because I don't think the average MP who's just run off their feet day after day, meeting their constituents and trying to understand legislation that's being thrown at them by their government, I don't think they intend these consequences. Are there people in the drafting process who do intend these consequences? Quite possibly. So it's a bit of each. I always do work off the saying, though, if I had a choice between conspiracy and incompetence, I'm going to assume incompetence most of the time. And I do think this legislation in Queensland was drafted very hastily when the anti-discrimination legislation was pulled off the table. And so I do think that for most of the MPs out there, they just don't intend this to happen. Are there people who have intended it to happen? Quite possibly, yeah.
Vince, anything further to add?
All right, yeah. Look, it's yeah. Well, I'll still stick with my gut, gut instinct. I mean, I can't say absolutely definitively, of course. Yeah, that is. Look, just a quick one with a gentleman from Victoria before the news, where he was saying he heard some horrible, disgusting things about Muhammad. I did see a video about that, but a researcher called David Wood. But what I stress, most of that referring to Muhammad actually isn't mentioned in the Quran that much. It was what's called the Hadith. Now, most Islamic, they were written after, I think, Muhammad's death. Some Islamic clerics say we only go by the Quran, although most Islamic clerics, I think, do accept the Hadiths. And all this disturbing stuff, the gentleman from Victoria mentioned, I think that they are written in the Hadith, which is generally, accepted by most. And
there's
Muslim
plenty
clerics
to explore for those listeners who want to be just a little bit more informed about how those Abrahamic faiths actually work together, and the deceit or the untruths that are presented there, they can be fairly obvious, I think, with a little bit of research. But Vince, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 if you'd like to join in our conversation. Just coming back to, your thinking that maybe a lot of this stuff happens innocently and it's not a conspiracy. This is an interesting one for us because, most of us will fall one way or the other. Some people are quick to claim there's a conspiracy, and some people are quick to say that this is just an innocent mistake. I was interested in your response there, Mike. And is there a good reason why we ought to just rely on the fact that there maybe is an innocent mistake being made in some of this proposed legislation rather than a conspiracy? Any thoughts from you here?
Well, let's not forget that there is a conspiracy, a much, much bigger and deeper conspiracy, and that is that the ruler of the air, the former ruler of this world, Satan, has a conspiracy to be attacking his people. We've got a much bigger spiritual war that we are dealing with, and then everything else that's going on are symptoms of the fact that we are living in a spiritual battle between good and evil, between God's people and the devil. So put it in that perspective, and everything is a conspiracy. But it also means that people who are intentionally trying to write legislation to shut down Christianity, that's a real thing, absolutely. But also people who are just caught up in the zeitgeist of this world, who just hear about, we've got to do it to care for these kids because these kids are so horribly oppressed and terrified, so you've just got to do something. Those people are still just caught up in the same spiritual conspiracy, but from their point of view, they don't realize what they're doing. So we've got to deal with each individual person from their personal motives. And I just prefer not to say, everyone who disagrees with me is doing it because they know they want to hate me and shut me down. Talking with a lot of MPs who strongly disagree with what we say about sexuality and things like that, they still just do it because they kind of think that they're looking after and helping kids. They don't realise the implications of what they're doing to religious freedom. So when we sit down and talk to them and explain it to them, you can start making some headway. Telling everyone that they're bad people and it's a conspiracy, it shuts down the conversation. So it's complicated, is the simple answer.
But you actually do make a really powerful point for Christian believers, that this is not just a secularised debate where it's just about one opinion against another, that there is a cosmic conspiracy and that there is a battle between good and evil. There is a battle between the powers of light or the powers of darkness, and those sorts of things we cannot ignore. And so, in fact, sometimes just to recognise that there is a spiritual battle that's going on, and that we are in fact called to be participants in that spiritual battle, whether it's by prayer or whether it's by action. That's an important element. And so this is something no doubt you come up against from time to time, Mike. People are saying, is this something that Christians should do, to have a voice politically, to have a voice about values? What's your typical response when you've got Christians who say, come on, Mike, what are you doing? You're getting involved in all this political stuff.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that Paul, the Apostle Paul, when he was arrested, when he was oppressed, he had no problem standing up and saying, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do that. You've got to treat me according to being a Roman citizen. He used his citizenship in the end to get himself to Rome, to proclaim the gospel to the leaders of the empire. So it's well within our rights, is that the right word? But God has given us citizenship in Australia as well as citizenship in heaven, and we're to use that citizenship. Thank God we live in a democracy where we get to speak to our MPs and tell them, if you do this, I'm not going to vote for you. Let's use that power that God has given us.
So there's a thought that, God has been at the foundation of our legal system and of our courts even. So there's this encouragement even to make use of those to be able to maintain the sort of peace and harmony in your community that you've come to expect with the Christian foundation that's come in Australia. So in some sense, we've got the right mechanisms. We need to be able to utilise those effectively.
Absolutely. God has given us a whole bunch of tools to use, and now it's about thinking out, but it's important to use them lovingly, to use them the way Christ would have used them. We don't attack people, we don't shout at people, we don't hate people. We call them to repentance, we point out the problems in their legislations, and we say it powerfully but lovingly.
And I imagine we need to speak loud enough to know that we've been heard, because with those recent accusations, the things that came out of the Australian Law Reform Commission, there were all sorts of submissions given by the same church leaders that are signing off on this new letter that's going off to Queensland today. But there are church leaders who are making submissions into all of these different reviews that are going on. And if they're being ignored, something else has to happen to make their voice heard. Is that an effective way of talking about how we're thinking here?
Absolutely. And in a democracy, the best way of getting volume is numbers. Lots and lots of individual people having a quiet conversation with their MP, writing an email to their MP, and simply saying, I'm worried about this. Because politicians, when lots of people contact them, they start listening. They'll go dig up that submission. They'll go find that letter from the Premier and read it themselves. When lots of people say something, that's when politicians start getting convinced.
Okay, I love your very simple but profound way of being an influence when you're writing to your MP. I'm a little concerned about this. Can you please fix it? I mean, that's one sentence. Maybe you could expand that to two if you're wanting to be flowery. But how people... Now, two things to draw attention to, especially the New South Wales issues with the Equality Bill. You're saying, Mike, now is the time to write to your MP in New South Wales. Is there a way that on the Freedom for Faith website that people can easily connect with MPs?
Yes. If you go to our website, fff.org.au, scroll down a little bit, you'll find a button, and it will take you to a website which will give you a guide. You can look up your MP, you can put in your suburb, find who your MP is, get a couple of tips about things to say, connect with any emails, any letter. So in Queensland, if you go to the same website, the Premier's letter will be there and you can attach the letter. But New South Wales, go right to your MP now, fff.org.au, and scroll down a little bit, and you'll get everything you need to write to your MP and just simply say quickly, yeah, I'm really worried about this. Don't pass this bill.
And you've got your national conference coming up, and for people who say, oh, it's just something that's on in Sydney, well, everywhere is close enough to be able to get a free live stream, and there'll be expert commentary that will come about the issues as things deteriorate in our freedom for faith or our freedom of religious freedom here in Australia. So for listeners, that Freedom for Faith National Conference is on Monday the 5th of August, at Village Church, Annandale in Sydney, and there is free live stream tickets this year. And so for listeners in communities all over Australia, you'll be able to get your ticket and participate in that conference. Is there anything you can tell us about the conference, any of the speakers or any of the topics that will be covered that might just give a little extra impetus?
Oh, absolutely. So we've got we're talking a bit about the history of religious freedom and how that came about and how we think about it in Australia. We're talking about a theological way of thinking about what do we do when the government tells us to do something that we can't do. So we have one of Australia's leading ethicists and theologians, John McLean, thinking through that idea. We're going to be talking about what's going on in Queensland, in New South Wales. We're going to give you an update on the federal religious discrimination bill and where that's up to. And look, within a month's time, the answer may be different to where it is right now. And we're going to be talking about what do we do next? What is the next 12 months of religious freedom going to look like, and how can you be involved?
It'll be important, and that website is fff.org.au, Freedom for Faith, fff.org.au, and take advantage of the opportunity. And while it's fresh in your mind, Mike Southon is Executive Director of Freedom for Faith. Mike, thank you so much for taking some time to share these thoughts with listeners today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's been great.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.